The Exodus didn't end the way many people imagine, and maybe not even Moses expected such a profound, symbolic, and silent conclusion. There's a mystery surrounding those final steps in the wilderness, a secret kept at the top of a mountain where promises were seen but never touched. Today you're going to feel the weight of the journey, the tension of faith, and uncover truths hidden among the sands of time. This isn't just a story. It's a farewell, a new beginning. It's about promises, losses, and victories, and above all, it's about what God does when man thinks the story has already ended. The Hebrew people were free, finally free. After generations of pain, bricks, and chains under the brutal yoke of Egypt, there they were, outside the gates, standing on desert ground, eyes wide, hearts pounding with a mix of hope and uncertainty. It was the final Exodus, the moment when Moses' story took on epic proportions. But what do you do with newfound freedom? It was like walking out of a prison without knowing if there was a home waiting or just more wilderness. God's promise still echoed, biblical Canaan, the famous promised land, flowing with milk and honey. But between their triumphant exit from Egypt and their arrival in ancient Canaan were miles of desert, doubt, sweat, and sand. The people of Israel didn't know it yet, but they were about to experience their final days in the wilderness like never before. And this is where few tell the full story, the true story of the Exodus. A story where freedom doesn't mean ease. Imagine the shock. An entire people used to taking orders now had to make decisions for themselves. Total freedom, but zero experience with autonomy. It's like pulling someone out of the depths and immediately placing them on a tightrope. That was the Hebrew journey. What seemed like the end of the road, the end of the biblical Exodus, was actually just the first step of one of the greatest spiritual and geographic pilgrimages in the Bible. A moment where the past collided with the future with every step through the sand. Moses, the great deliverer, became the link between God and the people. He was the one who calmed them, guided them, listened, and spoke. But even with a strong leader, the feeling of uncertainty spread like the hot wind of the ancient Middle East. Between murmurs and promises, between what was left behind in Egypt and what had yet to be seen in Canaan, the people wavered. The book of Exodus shows that this wasn't just a simple escape, it was a tearing of the soul. And here lies one of the great truths of the Hebrew people. Freedom has a price, and sometimes the highest cost is learning to reinvent yourself. The Israelite pilgrimage didn't begin with manna and miracles. It began with doubts, questions, and the need to learn how to be free. What came next? A desert full of trials. And that path wasn't made of sand alone. There were tests invisible to the eye. The desert wasn't just sand, it was a battlefield of the unseen. With Egypt in the rearview mirror and biblical Canaan still out of reach, the people of Israel had to face a harsh truth. Freedom had led them straight into the chaos of uncertainty. There was no water, no food, no clear direction. The wilderness journey, so often mentioned in Old Testament texts, became a divine training ground. Surviving there required more than physical strength. It was a daily test of faith. Just days in, thirst set in. Imagine thousands of parched voices echoing under blistering heat. The people cried out, Moses prayed, and then a miracle. Water flowed from a rock, and when hunger struck, the heavens opened and manna rained down. It was as if the impossible happened every morning. But even with miracles, the human heart wavers. The people grumbled, tested, complained. God's promise felt distant, and many asked, was this really the right path? Internal conflicts flared like hidden embers beneath the sand. There was even longing for Egypt, as strange as that sounds. Some said that at least there they had onions, meat, stability. Unbelievable, yes, but real. And that's where one of the greatest paradoxes of the wilderness pilgrimage emerges. Slavery had ended, but the slave mentality was still alive. It wasn't enough to leave Egypt. Egypt had to be pulled out of them. Moses in the wilderness was a leader burdened, a mediator between heaven and earth. He heard everything, saw everything, and carried on his shoulders a people who at times wanted to turn back. Yet it was in that very desert where the first signs of transformation appeared. The people who once only obeyed were beginning to learn the value of willing obedience. Every step through the dust of the desert held a hidden lesson, and the mysteries of the Bible are full of these pearls. It was there, under the scorching heat and in trials that went far beyond the physical, that an entire generation began to be shaped. The true story of the Exodus shows that the wilderness journey wasn't just about geography. It was a spiritual metamorphosis. But all of that was just the beginning, because soon God would call Moses to ascend Mount Sinai. And there, new laws would change everything. Climbing Mount Sinai wasn't just about scaling a mountain. It was about crossing the line between the natural and the supernatural. Moses ascended alone, but he carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders. The scene is straight out of an epic film. Thunder, lightning, smoke, a God who speaks from within the fire. And there, at the summit of that sacred mountain in the heart of the Sinai wilderness, an eternal covenant was born. The book of Exodus presents this moment as a turning point, the moment when the people of Israel stopped being just wanderers and became a nation with a purpose. The Sinai covenant was clear. If you fully obey me, you will be my treasured possession among all nations. And to seal this agreement, God gave the Ten Commandments, divine guidelines that still echo through the ages. No riddles, no cryptic mysteries, straightforward rules, a moral and spiritual code of conduct. It was a manual for a generation shaped by suffering and sand to finally understand what God expected of them and what he was willing to do in return. Once again, Moses was the messenger. With stone tablets in hand and eyes burning with glory, he came down the mountain as God's spokesperson. It was a confirmation of his leadership. Moses and Joshua, his faithful assistant, were beginning to understand that leading people meant more than just pointing the way. It meant translating heaven to earth. This wasn't just a historical moment. It was spiritual, symbolic, eternal. God's promise was slowly becoming tangible in laws that would shape the future. But not everyone was thrilled to hear those commands. The truth is, some people were uncomfortable. Rules, boundaries, commitments. Not everyone was ready for that. After all, living without chains is one thing. Living with purpose is something entirely different. And this is where many stumble, in the kind of freedom that requires responsibility. Have you ever stopped to think about that? That sometimes the greatest gift is actually having direction. There on Sinai, something deep was happening. A new identity was being written. It was the beginning of a collective spirituality, something born from above, yet meant to be lived on the hot ground of real life. But while Moses was receiving the law up on the mountain, something scandalous was brewing down below. A failure so severe it nearly undid everything. And now, the very people who had just received divine direction were about to trip over their own faith. While Moses was high on Mount Sinai, surrounded by the divine presence, the people below grew restless. Time passed, and he didn't come down. And since anxiety loves to create monsters, that's exactly what happened. They molded gold, melted down memories of Egypt, and crafted a calf, a symbol, a spiritual collapse that still echoes today as a warning. What happened wasn't just idolatry, it was spiritual amnesia. They exchanged the promise of God for something shiny, and the sound of faith was replaced with the noise of a party without purpose. Aaron, Moses' brother, faltered. He gave in to the pressure. He led the creation of the idol. How could someone so close to God fall so badly? Here's one of the hidden truths of the Bible. Even the chosen stumble when fear tightens its grip. And the people danced, celebrated, as if the freshly made covenant meant nothing. It was a rejection of God's authority. The true story of the Exodus shows us that behind that golden calf were hearts still chained to Egypt and to slavery. even while walking in freedom. When Moses came down and saw it all, the shock was visceral. He shattered the tablets, destroyed the calf, confronted Aaron. His fury wasn't just human, it was a reflection of divine disappointment. The wilderness journey now took on a new tone, the tone of repentance. The people of Israel hadn't just made a mistake, they nearly severed their connection with the Creator himself. It was as if, in the blink of an eye, the thread between heaven and earth had been torn. The consequences were harsh. There was death, weeping, shame, but there was also opportunity. Moses interceded, prayed, stood in the people's place, and in that moment he showed why he was chosen. Even after betrayal, God rewrote the tablets. Another chance. This part of Exodus is a masterclass on new beginnings, a reminder that even when we fail badly, God still offers a way back, but not without making it clear that things won't go back to exactly how they were. That scene left scars, not just on the people, but on the entire Israelite pilgrimage. It was a breach of trust, a turning point, and even though the calf was destroyed, spiritual insecurity would continue to hover. How do you trust a people so quick to turn away? How do you lead those who constantly test the limits of divine patience? Those questions would begin to carry weight, especially as the most decisive moment drew near, the chance to finally enter Canaan. They were so close, so near to biblical Canaan, they could almost smell the giant grapes described by the spies. Following God's command, Moses sent 12 men to scout the land. The mission? To confirm that God's promise was real. But what returned wasn't just a report, it was an emotional bombshell. 10 came back full of fear, speaking of giants, fortified cities, and a people too strong to defeat. Only 2, Joshua and Caleb, kept their faith alive. That moment was a turning point. The people listened to the pessimists and ignored the brave. The promised land was right there, within reach, but their trust crumbled like dry sand. It was a rejection of the promise, a refusal of a gift offered by God himself. It was like looking at the future and saying, "We don't believe it's possible." The revealed biblical story shows that the problem wasn't the size of the enemies, it was the size of the faith they lacked. And the consequence, a judgment that would echo through generations. God declared, "This generation will not enter Canaan." Heavy words. They had left Egypt full of hope, but now they were condemned to die in the wilderness. The wilderness journey shifted in meaning. It was no longer a path to a destination. It became a waiting room, a cycle of forced learning, a punishment, yes, but also a preparation. Because the promised land could not be inhabited by people who still thought like slaves, it was time to begin forming a new generation. Joshua and Caleb, the only 2 who remained faithful, were spared. A glimpse of future leadership began to take shape. The people, realizing their mistake, tried to enter the land by force, but it was too late. They were defeated, a hard lesson. When you reject God's direction, even last-minute bravery won't fix it. Ancient Canaan would have to wait, and the people of Israel would have to march for much, much longer. And so began the longest years of the wilderness pilgrimage, 40 years under the scorching sun, surrounded by dunes and memories of a missed opportunity. That generation would have to watch their children grow up and, one day, claim the inheritance they had rejected. But what seemed like punishment was, in secret, also a chance for transformation. Because the desert still had much to teach, and a new identity was beginning to rise from the sands. 40 years, a lifetime. For many, it felt like punishment, a consequence of that one moment of unbelief before the promised land. But was it only that? The true story of the Exodus reveals something deeper. The wilderness was also a place of transformation. The generation that came out of Egypt had to be deconstructed. The slave mentality had to be erased to build the spirit of a free nation, one ready to inherit God's promise. Those years shaped character, strengthened faith, and revealed leaders. The people learned to rely on daily manna, on the cloud that guided them by day, and the fire that warmed them by night. It wasn't just survival. It was spiritual, psychological, and communal training. The children of those who had feared Canaan were now growing up with a different vision. Biblical Canaan would not be given to those who doubted, but to those born learning to trust the invisible. Imagine it, an entire people living without a fixed home, constantly setting up and breaking down camp, walking in circles. The Israelite pilgrimage became a symbol of divine waiting. It wasn't about speed, it was about process. And as they walked, they learned. God spoke, corrected, taught, and often tested. It was like a long, real-life wilderness where every step carried a new lesson. And let's be honest, how many of us today are living our own symbolic 40 years? Throughout this wilderness journey, defining moments arose. Internal rebellions like Korah's, plagues, miracles, the bronze serpent. Each event was a mirror of the people's collective soul, a reflection of the tension between faith and fear, between obedience and resistance. The Old Testament doesn't hide the stumbles. It shows, unfiltered, the highs and lows of a journey that exposed the spiritual core of the Hebrew people. And it leaves us with a question. What are you doing with the time God gives you between promise and fulfillment? In truth, the desert was a landscape of disguised opportunities. It wasn't just a delay, it was a school where Moses kept teaching and God patiently kept preparing the people for something greater. But time was moving on, and Moses was feeling the weight of the years. His role was nearing its end, and while the new generation matured, he was approaching his own final turning point. And what came next? A single mistake, one that would change everything for him. Moses led the people with firmness, courage, and a faith that defied logic. He stood before Pharaoh, parted the sea, interceded countless times, and heard God's voice like few ever have. But even the greatest have moments of weakness. In what seemed like a simple act, striking the rock instead of speaking to it, Moses crossed a line that God had clearly drawn, and with that act, his mission shifted course. The story of Moses turned from conquest to farewell. It hurt. Imagine decades of leading an ungrateful multitude, enduring inhuman challenges, only to be denied entry to the promised land at the very end. What happened with Moses shows us that even giants of faith are human. His mistake was more than a rash gesture. It was a breach of holiness before the people. God loved him, but choices have consequences. One of the most striking biblical curiosities is exactly this. The man who led the people out of Egypt never stepped foot in Canaan. Knowing his time was near, Moses spoke. And what a speech! He recalled the entire journey, warned them, encouraged them, reaffirmed the Sinai covenant. It was as if he were saying, "I won't go with you, but you will go, and you must be ready." This moment stands among the most powerful in the book of Exodus, not only for its content, but for its emotion. It was a leader passing the baton with a full heart. The final Exodus wouldn't be led by him, but by those who had learned from him. Moses didn't rebel or try to argue. Instead, he chose to prepare the way. A true teacher is revealed in how they say goodbye. And that's exactly what he did. He knew that the biblical Jordan River marked a boundary his feet would not cross. But he also knew that his mission wasn't about territory. It was about transforming a people. And in that, he was unmatched. He left Egypt with slaves, and now looked upon heirs. But before his departure, there was still one final mountain to climb, a lookout. From there, he would see the promised land with his own eyes. His heart pounded, not for what was coming, but for what had been fulfilled. It was time to close the chapter. And in that high place, between heaven and the soil of ancient Canaan, Moses would surrender his soul to the Creator and make room for a new leader, a name already familiar to those who had been paying attention. At the top of Mount Nebo, Moses gazed upon what he had carried in his heart for 40 years, Canaan, finally, before his eyes. The promised land was no longer a rumor or a distant hope. It was real, visible right there, but untouchable. The end of the biblical Exodus approached with solemn silence, and there, with no audience, no statue, no public ceremony, the greatest leader of the Israelite pilgrimage rested. The Bible says that God himself took care of his burial. One of the greatest secrets of the Hebrew people is that no one knows where Moses' body lies. His death wasn't just the end of a man, it was the end of an era. Moses carried on his shoulders the transition from slavery to promise. He was the link between Egypt and Canaan. His departure marked the final page of a generation and the beginning of a new chapter in God's promise. Mount Nebo became a symbol, the place where you see but don't touch, where you realize that sometimes the mission isn't to enter, it's to prepare those who will. Think about it. How many of us live similar experiences? You plant, water, fight, and someone else reaps, and that's okay. That too is legacy. What happened with Moses teaches us that not every victory needs to be lived to be real. He never set foot in biblical Canaan, but he lived the promise every day in the wilderness. His journey was far more than a destination. It was a calling. And fulfilling the calling, even without the expected ending, is one of the greatest spiritual triumphs. The narrative of his death carries a sacred mystery, a hidden burial, a body concealed by God. Why? Maybe so no one would turn Moses into an idol, or to remind them that the story would continue, with or without him. The true story of the Exodus doesn't end with him. The people of Israel still had ground to cover. And now, without Moses at the helm, the challenge was a new one: move forward, under new leadership. And that leadership had been forming for years. Someone who had been present in every battle, every miracle, every decision. A familiar face, a matured faith. It was time for Joshua to step out of the shadows and take command. His name already echoed through the camps. And now, with Moses gone, the moment had come for a new voice to lead the people toward the crossing of the Jordan. Joshua didn't show up out of nowhere. He had been there from the beginning, the faithful assistant, the quiet shadow of Moses. He was the young warrior who climbed the mountain, who entered the tent of meeting, who stayed close to leadership without ever trying to take it. The wilderness journey was also the stage for his preparation. When Moses was gone, Joshua didn't just inherit a title, he inherited a calling. And now the promised land was no longer a distant vision, it was the next step. The choice didn't come from the people, it came from God. The book of Exodus had already hinted at it. And now, in the following book, Joshua's name rises to center stage. God strengthens him with the words every leader needs to hear: be strong and courageous. And there, among a generation shaped by the wilderness, a new spiritual general arose, a man who didn't just believe in the promise, but who was ready to fight for it. The end of the biblical Exodus was now in his hands. But Joshua didn't have the same mission as Moses. While one delivered, the other would conquer. It was the beginning of a new strategy. No longer was it about escaping Egypt and slavery, it was about taking possession of ancient Canaan. And that transition is powerful because it shows us that every season requires a different kind of leadership. Joshua represented the generation that grew up in the wilderness, not burdened by the trauma of slavery, but strengthened by the resilience of survival. The people looked to him with respect, but also with great expectation. After all, following Joshua meant crossing the biblical Jordan River, something their parents had feared. His leadership began with bold decisions, clear strategies, and unshakable faith. And unlike Moses, Joshua didn't just speak of promise, he spoke of possession. It was time to act, to move, to occupy. God's promise now came with practical instructions. And before crossing the Jordan, Joshua began organizing the people. Tribes were aligned, priests prepared, hearts focused. The promised land was just ahead, but the final challenge was still to come. It was the moment when this new generation, led by a new commander, would prove whether they had truly learned all that the desert had tried to teach them. Because the last edge before Canaan still had to be crossed. They didn't see the sea part, but they had heard the stories, told night after night around the desert campfires. This new generation had grown up hearing about slavery in Egypt, but never felt the weight of chains on their wrists. They were born in freedom, yet forged in the harshness of the wilderness. The Israelite pilgrimage became the cradle of a different kind of people, more resilient, more willing, more shaped by faith than by fear. They didn't just inherit the promise, they inherited the responsibility too. The difference between this generation and the previous one was striking. While their parents murmured, the children marched. While the former doubted, the latter obeyed. The mindset had shifted. It was no longer a time to complain, it was time to conquer. And perhaps this is one of the hidden truths of the Bible. Sometimes God has to wait for one generation to pass in order to fulfill his promise through those who are ready to embrace the new. The people of Israel were now different, stronger, more united. Joshua saw it up close. These young men and women had a fire in their eyes. They knew that biblical Canaan wouldn't fall from the sky. They would have to fight, trust, and follow instructions. This new generation was the living symbol of the transformation God had been shaping since the beginning of the final Exodus. They had seen heaven rain down manna, but they also knew the next meal would come from land conquered with their own hands. It was faith in action, prayer with a sword, a new era. The Old Testament emphasizes that this people were not just heirs of promises, but of stories. They carried in their blood the legacy of Moses, the strategic vision of Joshua, and the weight of past failures. All of that became fuel. And let's be honest, who hasn't learned more from the mistakes of others than from their own successes? This generation learned, and that's why they were ready to take the step their parents refused. But before stepping into the long-dreamed land, there was one last obstacle, a natural border, a river. The Jordan stood before them as if saying, "Let's see if you're really ready." And the answer would come, not through words, but through bold steps into the water. The waters of the Jordan flowed before them, calm on the surface, but heavy with meaning. It was the final obstacle before the long-awaited Promised Land. After years of wandering through the Sinai Desert, experiencing miracles, failures, and fresh starts, the people of Israel had finally arrived at the banks of the biblical Jordan River. It wasn't just a river. It was the symbol of the transition from promise to possession. The air was thick with emotion. That moment carried the weight of centuries of waiting. Joshua, now the official leader, didn't hesitate. He received precise instructions from God. The priests were to step into the water, carrying the Ark of the Covenant. There would be no raised staff like at the Red Sea. This time, the miracle would begin with a step of faith. This crossing of the Jordan was different, more mature, more intentional. The new generation had to trust before they saw. A challenge fit for a people born in the wilderness. And then it happened. When the priest's feet touched the water, the river stopped flowing. The waters parted, and a dry path opened in the midst of the current. The people crossed, one by one, silent, awestruck, crossing not only the Jordan's riverbed, but also an inner barrier, the fear of never arriving. The revealed biblical story in that moment is breathtaking. It was the defining mark of the end of the final Exodus, and the beginning of the conquest of ancient Canaan. Right there, Joshua commanded 12 stones to be set up, one for each tribe, a memorial. Because he knew time passes, but stories must be remembered. How many times do we cross a Jordan in life and forget what we learned in the process? Those stones weren't just decoration, they were witnesses, a living testimony that God keeps his promises, and that it's worth trusting even when the path looks impossible. But it wasn't all rest and reward. On the other side of the river, the journey was just beginning. The promised land was real, but it was also occupied. There would be battles, walls, strategies, and hard choices ahead. The biblical geography made it clear Canaan wouldn't be a wrapped gift, it would be a hard-won conquest. The people had crossed the river, But now they would have to claim, step by step, every inch of what God had promised. Crossing the Jordan marked the final chapter of one story and the first line of another. The final Exodus had come to its symbolic close. There was no longer a cloud by day, no manna from heaven, no mobile tent. Now, the people of Israel stood on solid ground, ready to set foot in biblical Canaan, not as dreamers, but as rightful heirs. It was the end of the biblical Exodus, but the beginning of the true battle, conquering what God had promised. The new generation, under Joshua's leadership, no longer lived in the shadow of Egypt and slavery. Their challenges were different. It was time to bring down walls, literally. The conquest of Jericho lay just ahead, a test of obedience and divine strategy. Joshua's leadership became more defined with every step. The crossing of the Jordan wasn't the destination. It was the key that opened the gate to a new era. The promise was becoming possession. Interestingly, many assume that arriving in the promised land meant happily ever after. But Exodus, and the story that follows, shows that ancient Canaan was the beginning of a new phase of challenges. With freedom comes responsibility, and with promise comes battle. God's promise was never a passive reward. It was an invitation to action, a lesson that still echoes today. It's not enough to want what is rightfully yours. You need courage to claim it. The end of the Exodus was more than geographic. It was emotional, spiritual, and symbolic. The people who left Egypt as a mass of slaves were now an organized nation, determined and with a clear identity. The final days in the wilderness served to purify the soul, prepare the heart, and train the feet for the right steps. What began with Moses in the desert ended with Joshua stepping boldly into the promised land. And the story, like you've never seen it before, it was just beginning. Because the end of the Exodus isn't a period, it's a comma between what was and what's still to come. Biblical Canaan became the stage for new battles, but also for harvests. The desert taught, the river opened, the land was revealed, and now the stage was set for the next act of this great saga. After all, the secrets of the Hebrew people still challenge the mind and heart, even today. Had you ever heard this story in such detail? Do we truly understand what it means to enter the promise? Or are many still wandering in the desert without realizing it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective might awaken something in someone else too. And of course, if this content made you see things differently, if it brought something new to you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because here we reveal the Bible like you've never seen before. And there's a lot more powerful content on the way.